It's kind of strange, isn't it? How we're just drawn to these like really dark stories.
Yeah.
These dark parts of like human behavior. Like, why are we so interested in serial killers?
Yeah, it's that morbid curiosity, right? We want to understand it.
Yeah. And today we're talking about Desmond Dominique Jennings.
Yeah.
And he's an enigma, right? Like, we don't even, the sources we have can't even agree on like how many victims.
Right.
Some say 5, some say it could be as high as 20.
What strikes me about this case is like the dissonance between Jennings's profession and his crimes. I mean, this is a guy who worked as a nursing aide, someone who's dedicated to caring for the vulnerable.
Right.
And to then become a perpetrator of such violence.
Yeah.
It just begs the question, what could have led to such a drastic shift?
Like, how does that even happen?
Right.
And it's even more confusing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the sources we have give us very little about his early life.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder about those missing pieces of the puzzle, doesn't it?
Yeah, like, what are we missing?
I mean, what happened in his formative years that might have set him on this path?
Right.
How might understanding those early experiences help us shed light on his later actions?
We may never know, but we can at least start with what we do know.
Okay.
So his known crime spree began in October of 1993 with a robbery
Okay.
at a drug house in Fort Worth, and it turned fatal.
Uh-huh.
And he wasn't alone. A man named John Freeman was also involved, as well as a few others.
So this initial crime, it really seems like the catalyst.
Yeah.
It sets off like this chain reaction of escalating violence.
Yeah.
It's almost like a tipping point. After this, Jennings just fully embraces this path of brutality.
And that brutality becomes terrifyingly clear just a few months later.
Huh.
Christmas Eve, 1993.
Oh, wow.
Jennings and Freeman commit another double murder again in Fort Worth.
It's just, the timing is so chilling, It just suggests a complete disregard for the sanctity of life, a willingness to violate even the most cherished traditions.
And then just a few days later, December 27th,
Okay.
they strike again. This time, their victims are Sylvester Walton and Wanda Matthews.
Okay.
And again in Fort Worth. And this is where the details become truly horrifying.
Yeah. This particular crime, it just stands out for its brutality.
Yeah.
Jennings shoots Walton in the face and Matthews in the head.
Right.
But then as they're leaving, he hears Matthews moaning.
Oh, no.
And he just goes back and shoots her again.
It's not even like a spontaneous thing. It's so deliberate,
Exactly.
cold, and just no mercy.
And to just add to like the depravity of the whole scene, Jennings then steals a pouch from Walton's body.
It's like he's not even like processing what he's doing at this point.
It really raises more questions than answers. Was it just opportunism, some kind of like macabre trophy?
Right, yeah.
Or was it a further attempt to just like dehumanize his victims, to like erase them?
It's a disturbing thought for sure, but Jennings' reign of terror wouldn't last forever.
No.
And it's interesting how it all came crashing down.
Seemingly like a totally unrelated event leads investigators right to him.
And that event centers around John Freeman,
Okay.
Jennings' accomplice.
Mm.
He was arrested while driving a car that matched a robbery report.
Talk about bad luck, huh?
Talk about bad luck. But it was a crucial break in the case. A search of the car uncovered a loaded .32 caliber handgun right there in the trunk.
And I bet I know what happened next.
Ballistics testing linked that gun to the murders of Walton and Matthews.
Okay, yeah.
It was the evidence that they needed.
Yeah.
That solidified the case against Jennings.
Now, for someone like me, I love true crime. That part is always so fascinating.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about like how ballistics works?
Sure.
Why is it so important for law enforcement?
So basically, every firearm, it leaves unique markings on the bullets and casings it fires.
Okay.
Kind of like a fingerprint,
Wow.
So investigators, when they recover bullets from a crime scene, they can compare those markings to bullets test-fired from a suspect's weapon.
If the markings match, it's a definitive link. It puts the weapon at the scene of the crime.
So in this case, finding that gun in Freeman's car and then matching it to the murders, that was it for Jennings.
Exactly. It was irrefutable evidence directly connecting him to those murders.
Okay, but what about Freeman?
Nah.
If they were both involved, why did they get such different sentences?
Right.
Jennings was sentenced to death. Freeman got 30 years in prison.
Yeah, that difference in sentencing probably comes down to a few key factors. The severity of their roles in the crimes, the level of premeditation,
Right.
and any potential, mitigating circumstances. The court would have considered all of that. You know, it's a complex process. They weigh the gravity of the offenses against any potential for rehabilitation.
And Jennings, he didn't have a happy ending. He reportedly refused a last meal.
That's right. It just paints this picture of a man seemingly resigned to his fate, maybe detached from any, earthly desires, but that apparent resignation wouldn't last. On the day of his execution, Jennings made it clear he was going to resist. He refused to leave his cell, and they had to subdue him with pepper spray.
It seems like even at the very end, he wanted to have some kind of control.
Right.
To just defy the system.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Even facing death, that human instinct for autonomy, for agency, it can be really powerful.
Yeah, and that defiance continued until the very end.
Yeah.
When it came time for the execution, he resisted again.
Right.
It took a 5-man team to get him out of his cell.
It's just a stark reminder of the complexities of capital punishment, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even in those final moments, the human will to survive, to assert control, can manifest in powerful ways.
And when asked if he had any last words, Jennings just simply said, "No, I do not."
A final act of defiance, maybe? Or maybe a reflection of a deep-seated resignation? I mean, we can only speculate what was going on in his mind in those final moments.
All we know for sure is Desmond Dominique Jennings was pronounced dead at 6:22 p.m. on November 16, 1999. But his story doesn't end there. The impact of his crimes, the questions surrounding his motivations, and the ethical implications of his case, they linger long after his death.
And that's what we'll continue to explore, as we delve deeper into this case.
Yeah.
We'll examine, the lasting effects of his crimes on the community, the intricate workings of forensic science, and the broader debate surrounding capital punishment.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Definitely.
We've been talking about, all the details of Jennings's crimes, the chilling details. But it's important to remember that, this isn't just about one man.
Yeah.
And his descent into darkness. It's also about the victims and the impact,
Absolutely.
that this has on their families and the community.
These weren't just statistics,
Right.
These were real people with families, with lives that were tragically cut short.
And the trauma from something like that doesn't just disappear.
No.
That lingers. It shapes lives for years to come.
It really does.
Do any of the sources kind of offer, insight into the impact that this had on the families?
Unfortunately, the materials we have, they really focus on Jennings himself and the legal proceedings,
Right.
with very little attention given to the victims' families.
Yeah.
But it's important to acknowledge their suffering, and to remember that behind every act of violence, there are countless stories of pain and grief.
And it's not just the families. It's whole communities can be affected by these types of crimes, right?
Right. It creates this climate of fear and mistrust.
Yeah.
Yeah, a single act of violence, it can just shatter a community's sense of security.
Right.
And, people start to question everything, their surroundings, their neighbors, even their own safety.
It really is a reminder that crime doesn't exist in a vacuum.
No, it doesn't.
There are all these consequences.
Yeah.
It extends beyond the immediate victims.
Exactly. And speaking of consequences, it's also important to, recognize the role of law enforcement in bringing Jennings to justice. Their dedication, their perseverance were crucial in solving these cases.
Yeah.
And making sure that he was held accountable for his actions.
And earlier, we talked about ballistics testing, right? And how that linked Jennings to the murders.
Yes.
Are there other investigative techniques that played a role in his capture?
Certainly, in addition to ballistics, they would have relied on witness interviews,
Right.
crime scene analysis, and evidence collection. It's a very painstaking process, meticulously piecing together fragments of information to build a case.
It sounds like a puzzle, a real-life puzzle that these investigators are trying to put together
It is.
all the pieces. So it's not just luck.
It's not just luck, no.
It takes skill and strategy.
It takes a lot of skill, strategy, and a deep understanding of human behavior.
Yeah.
You got to follow the trail of evidence no matter how faint it might be.
Right.
Connect the dots to reveal the bigger picture. And in this case, that trail led to Desmond Dominique Jennings. But as fascinating as the investigative process is, we can't, ignore these broader ethical questions
Right.
raised by this case, particularly when it comes to capital punishment.
So we're talking about his death sentence.
Right.
And this sparks a huge debate that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah.
Is execution ever really justified?
It's a question with no easy answers. Supporters of capital punishment argue that it serves as a deterrent to crime,
Okay.
just retribution for these heinous acts, and a way to ensure that certain individuals can never harm society again.
But then there's also very strong counterarguments.
Oh, of course, yeah. Opponents of the death penalty, they worry about the risk of executing innocent people.
Right.
The potential for bias in the justice system, and the fundamental moral question of whether any state, any government, has the right to take a human life.
And those questions, they become even more complex when you have cases like Jennings, where we don't have a lot of information about his past.
It's his motivations, any potential mitigating factors.
When we sentence someone to death, are we really considering everything? The complexities of their life, their circumstances, the events that led them to that point?
Right.
Or are we just enacting revenge, perpetuating a cycle of violence?
It's hard to grapple with that, And there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Right.
Every case, every individual, it's all unique circumstances,
Exactly.
ethical considerations.
That's the challenge, right?
Yeah.
Trying to find a system of justice that balances accountability, rehabilitation, and protecting society while also upholding the fundamental dignity of every human life.
Right.
And this is a conversation that goes way beyond Desmond Dominique Jennings and what he did. It's a conversation that we as a society need to keep having.
I think one of the things that strikes me about just true crime in general is that it shows us the cracks in our systems, the complexities of human behavior.
And the challenges of achieving actual justice.
I think that's a very insightful observation. True crime isn't just about entertainment or morbid curiosity, is it?
Yeah.
It's a window into the human condition with all of its flaws and contradictions.
Yeah.
And maybe by going into these extreme cases, we can understand ourselves a little bit better and understand the potential for both good and evil within us all.
But even with all the analysis, all the speculation, there's a certain respect that we owe to the victims and their families.
Oh, absolutely.
It's so easy to get caught up in the details of the crime, the psychology of the perpetrator,
Right.
and just forget that real people were deeply affected by these acts.
It's vital to remember that behind the headlines, the court transcripts, the forensic reports, these are human lives that were shattered, families left to grieve, communities grappling with fear, with loss. Their stories deserve to be heard, to be remembered, even as we're trying to understand the perpetrator.
And it seems like their pain, gets overshadowed by the focus on the killer.
It does.
It's like everyone is focused on the monster, and they forget about the people he left behind.
It's a tragic consequence of these high-profile cases, but it's something that we can consciously try to counteract, by remembering the victims, honoring their memory, advocating for support systems that address the long-term impacts of trauma and loss.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the life and crimes of Desmond Dominique Jennings, I think we're left with more than just, a scary story of violence. It makes us think about human behavior, how fragile life is, and the enduring power of darkness and resilience.
I think that's a very insightful way to sum it up. We've explored the facts, we've analyzed the evidence, and we've grappled with these ethical questions.
Right.
But in the end, each listener, they have to come to their own conclusions. Consider what this case means to them personally. And maybe even use it as a catalyst for positive change in their own lives, in their own communities.
So where do we go from here? We've examined all the details of Jennings' crimes, the world of forensic science, and the moral dilemmas surrounding capital punishment.
Yeah.
And it just seems like his story, like a lot of stories in true crime, leaves us with more questions than answers.
It does.
So what are your final thoughts on the case of Desmond Dominique Jennings?
I think Jennings' story is a reminder that evil can be anywhere, That even the people we trust to care for others, they can betray that trust in the most horrific ways, but also highlights how important it is to seek justice, to hold perpetrators accountable, and to try to understand these complex factors that lead to these tragedies. And maybe most importantly, it reminds us that life is fragile, the impact of violence is lasting, and how important it is to foster empathy and compassion in a world that can often feel cold and indifferent.
It's a reminder that these aren't just stories.
No, they're not.
These are real lives, real tragedies.
They are.
Real consequences that carry on through time.
Yeah.
As we've been talking about Desmond Dominique Jennings, one thing keeps coming back to me, and it's like the big question, why?
Right.
We've talked about all these awful things he did, how he was caught, his execution, but like, we don't really know his motive.
That's what's so haunting about cases like this.
Yeah.
There's just no clear explanation. We try to figure out this darkness in the human heart, try to understand it, but sometimes it's just impossible.
It feels like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why we're so drawn to true crime.
Right.
We want to understand these really dark parts of the human mind.
It's that natural human curiosity.
Yeah.
We want to know what makes people do the things they do, especially when it's so different from what we expect.
Yeah, totally. And maybe by looking at these extreme cases, we can learn a little bit more about ourselves too, about the potential for good and bad that's inside all of us. But I think it's important to remember the victims and their families in all this.
Oh, absolutely.
It's so easy to get lost in the details of the crime or the psychology of the killer and forget that these were real people whose lives were changed forever.
You can't forget that. Behind all the news stories and the court documents, there were families that were broken, communities struggling with fear and loss.
Yeah.
Those are the stories that matter, and we have to remember them even as we try to understand why the crime happened.
Sometimes it feels like their pain is forgotten because everyone's so focused on the killer.
That does happen, yeah. We get fixated on the monster and forget about everyone they hurt.
Exactly.
But we can try to change that by actively remembering the victims, honoring their memory, and supporting programs that help people cope with the trauma of loss.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Desmond Dominique Jennings, we're left with more than just a chilling story, right?
Right.
It makes you think about human nature, how precious life is, and how darkness and resilience can exist side by side.
It's a story that challenges us, makes us think about good and bad, and hopefully makes us want to make the world a better place.
And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from our deep dive for him. These stories, even though they're disturbing, can remind us to appreciate the good things in life, try to understand each other better, and work to prevent these kinds of things from happening.
And never forget that knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more we understand about the dark side of humanity, the better equipped we are to fight for good in the world.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of the Desmond Dominique Jennings case. We hope you found it thought-provoking, maybe even inspired you to learn more about true crime and the complex issues it raises. Thanks for listening.